Well, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met with Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas in Jordan. Mr. Abbas heads the Palestinian Authority, which controls the occupied West Bank. He told Mr. Blinken that he rejects the forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. After days of silence since the Hamas terror attack that killed more than 1,300 Israelis, the Palestinian leader finally condemned violence against civilians by both sides. Well, our senior international correspondent, Fanny Fashar, is in Jerusalem, and she told me more about that meeting between the President of the Palestinian Authority and the US Secretary of State.
That meeting is quite important. In fact, it's pretty much the only channel that the United States, as well as the international community, has when it comes to the Palestinian territories, because Hamas, which is designated a terrorist organization, is obviously not the organization that the U.S. is going to seek any kind of channeling with. They are turning to the head of the Palestinian Authority, President Abbas, who's been seen already yesterday meeting Jordan's King Abdullah II, and it's expected that pretty much what's been talked about there in Jordan with Mr. Abdullah is also part of the conversation between Blinken and Abbas. And that is, number one, how to de-escalate the situation, and also how to make sure that the humanitarian corridors in place to help aid getting into Gaza Strip. Now, the U.S. Secretary of State Blinken meeting the head of the Palestinian Authority is important because he is in charge, partially in charge of occupied West Bank. However, Mr. Abbas doesn't have any control whatsoever since 2007 over Gaza. And also it's very important diplomatically, even though there may not be any immediate result from that meeting for the United States from the US perspective in this realm of several meetings that are on the way that are expected to happen. For example, Mr. Blinken is to go on from here, from Jordan, to meet the leaders of Qatar and the leader of Saudi Arabia, all in an effort trying to de-escalate, the U.S. government says, but also in an effort trying to somehow release the hostages. Many of them are also American. In fact, Qatar has already offered some sort of a mediation here with Hamas. They have close contacts with a Hamas militant group trying to release these hostages. But as we're hearing, apparently, at least according to the militant arm, the militant arm of the Hamas group, apparently 13 captives have been killed already during airstrikes by Israel last night.
Let's talk now to Middle East security analyst Jonathan Spire, also in Jerusalem. Welcome to DW. I'd like to talk about the role of the Palestinian Authority leader, Mahmoud Abbas, in this. We'll come to his comments in a sec, but first, let's start with his silence. Nothing until Antony Blinken arrives. What do we make of that?
I'm afraid what we need to make of it is that Mahmoud Abbas, in a certain sense, is responding rationally to his situation, which is that he and the Ramallah-based Palestinian Authority are simply not players in the drama currently unfolding in the Gaza Strip and in Israel, because, of course, as we know, since 2007, so for 16 years now, since the Hamas expelled his organization, Fatah and the PA, from the Gaza Strip, they have not wielded power or authority or indeed maintained any consequential, even political presence inside Gaza. So Mahmoud Abbas has been silent because, as the saying goes in English, whereof one has nothing to say, thereof one should be silent. I think he seems to be following that edict, and it's perfectly understandable.
And he opens his mouth now, and I'll just read you the quote that I have here. He called for an immediate end to the comprehensive aggression against the Palestinian people. He also rejected practices related to killing civilians or ambushing them on both sides. So, obviously quite an even-handed approach. No condemnation specifically of Hamas there. What do you make of that?
Well, absolutely. Abbas is, I suppose, following the usual line in Palestinian politics, whereby he will avoid criticizing other Palestinian factions which are engaged in warfare against Israel. I don't think anybody particularly needs to be surprised by this, because it's been a constant pattern, really, with Abbas and the PA over the last couple of years to avoid any such condemnation. I think what it further indicates, really, certainly many Israelis, I think, will see it as further indicating the extent to which no partner really for dialogue, unfortunately, exists on the Palestinian side. Nobody's under any illusions regarding the one side of Palestinian politics, Hamas. But really, I think what Abbas's response shows, but it won't come as a surprise, I think, either to Israelis or to many observers of the situation, is that he also, from his basic standpoint, I'm afraid, doesn't really constitute a partner for any coherent diplomatic process or progress to be made. But again, I don't think this needs to really surprise us. This is Abbas acting very much within the parameters which he's acted for some considerable time now.
So, given what you say about Mr. Abbas having no influence or authority over there in Gaza, why is Secretary of State Blinken, why is he there talking to him?
Yeah, that's actually an excellent question. And I'm afraid I personally find it rather difficult to answer. I mean, Secretary Blinken, it's understood, as a representative of the superpower and of a country which also affords a large amount of aid, by the way, to the Palestinian Authority, wishes to speak to all players on the ground, so to speak. But yeah, I would have to also question, really, in my estimation at least, whether that's a useful use of his time at the present time. But I think your correspondent also pointed out, and correctly, that of course the Americans have no open dialogue with Hamas because Hamas is a designated terror organization. So I suppose Secretary Blinken wants to meet with somebody from the Palestinian side. So he's chosen to meet with, as I said at the beginning, the somewhat irrelevant leader of the Ramallah Palestinian Authority at the present time, who has no say, no clout, so to speak, no ability to influence events on the ground in the Gaza Strip, and obviously not on the Israeli side either.
So who, either in the region or anywhere else, is in a position to influence Hamas activities? We've heard in the last couple of days about Qatar being used as some sort of intermediary. Are they the only people?
I would say that Hamas really in the Middle East region has three countries or states which are allied or aligned or supportive of it on one level or another. And those three countries are Islamic Republic of Iran, the Republic of Turkey, and the Emirate of Qatar. Now, with regard to Iran, the Iranians, of course, are the main military, or indeed the only military backers, or only significant military backers of Hamas. The Hamas military capacity, the M302 missiles, the Fajirs, even the tactical abilities that were displayed on Saturday derive from the relationship with Iran. So one could seek to talk to Iran, but of course that wouldn't be very useful because the Iranians are basically supportive of the Hamas slaughter, which took place on Saturday, and of their military efforts. That leaves you with Turkey and Qatar, who are not militarily backing Hamas, but they do maintain close diplomatic relationships with the movement. And indeed, Hamas leadership, top leadership, is currently resident in Doha, in Qatar. So yes, I think if one were looking to establish a channel of communication with Hamas, the sensible way to do it would probably go through Qatar, and that does indeed appear to be what is taking place. My own sense, at least certainly from the Israeli side, at least what we're seeing publicly, is that there's currently very little interest actually in a diplomatic channel. Israel wants to hit back militarily at the slaughter and murder of its citizens that took place on Saturday. And I think there's probably going to be, or I think we can all conclude really, there is going to be a military chapter to this on the ground before any diplomacy of any kind really has a realistic chance of moving forward. But yes, Qatar is the address, I would say, for Westerners and for Western countries seeking to make contact with and communication with Hamas.
Thanks for that. It's very clear. Security analyst Jonathan Spire in Jerusalem. Let's talk more about the Blinken visit with Ian Lesser. He's Vice President of the German Marshall Fund. That's a public policy think tank. Welcome to DW. What influence can the US bring to bear on this situation, given that it's been largely absent from this Middle East issue over the last few years?
Well, there are some important aspects of American influence in this, above all over Israeli strategy and policy. But even that, of course, would have its limits. I mean, as we can see with the Blinken visit, there are attempts to engage with nonviolent Palestinian political elements. Those have been ongoing, of course, for a very, very long time. But the Palestinian-Israeli track of the peace process, as you say, has not progressed in many, many years. Beyond that, when it comes to the hostage crisis and other aspects of this situation, I think the American influence is actually rather limited, but it is very important for the United States to talk to countries like Qatar and Turkey who may be able to play a role in that regard. When it comes to the military side of things, of course, the United States has much more leverage.
Because you factor into that as the US talks to Qatar and Turkey, and obviously not Iran, the three main people who can influence Hamas. That has to be seen under the shadow of America saying, we absolutely and unwaveringly back Israel, which kind of limits its room for manoeuvre.
Well, I think it does, but I think it's also inevitable because that is longstanding American policy, and that really transcends the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not entirely popular in Washington in many quarters, and there have been many differences with Israel in recent years. There could be differences over strategy now, but the basic principle of supporting Israel after this devastating attack, I think, is solid. And I think the Biden administration, or indeed any other American administration, would have pursued exactly the same course. I think it goes without saying.
The US is also in talks with Egypt about trying to create a humanitarian corridor to allow civilians to flee Gaza. The only crossing into Egypt at the moment, the Rafah crossing, we're told is being bombed by Israeli aircraft. So is such a humanitarian passage corridor likely to happen?
Well, it's possible. It's possible also that might be a place to establish a corridor for supplies to come into Gaza, to southern Gaza. Of course, Egypt is not keen on having Hamas or indeed Palestinian refugees from Gaza coming into Egypt. Egypt is already concerned by jihadist terrorism inside the country. And, the fact that the border has been closed is really, in part, for many years, the result of Egypt not wanting it to be open. So I think this will be rather difficult, but as the situation evolves and becomes more serious and more desperate in humanitarian terms, there may be an opening on that front. And the United States actually could play a role in talking to Egypt about that.
So the US has limited diplomatic heft in this particular situation, but it is on the military side, sending an aircraft carrier and warships to the region, as well as boosting military aid to Israel. So let's talk about the role of military defense in the US playbook in this situation.
Well, I think that forces that have been deployed to the Eastern Mediterranean are in part a signal of political support to Israel over the situation in Gaza. But I think more importantly, it's about the potential for escalation in Lebanon involving Hezbollah and Iranian-backed militias and even Iran directly, perhaps under some circumstances. And there, having these additional American forces available would make a very, very big difference. I think at the moment it's all about deterrence. But the other piece of this, which is less visible, but maybe is as important as anything else, is the intelligence cooperation that is surely going on between Israel and the United States and others who have hostages in Gaza. We have to see how this situation evolves, but obviously there are things that can be done on the intelligence gathering and even the special operations front where the United States could play a significant role.
Right. So it sounds unlikely that the US Secretary of State is going to come away from this visit with anything that looks like success.
Well, the nature of the situation at the moment makes it very difficult to define what anything that would look like success might look like. I think, simply making this visit...
I do apologise, Ian Lesser from the German Marshall Fund. We're going to cut it there because we're going now to a press conference between the US Defense Secretary and the Israeli Defense Secretary. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
The Secretary and I have just left the war room. We sat where decisions are made on Israeli security, on our most sensitive interests. I briefed the Secretary on strategic developments in our region, and the Chief of Staff, together with the IDF leadership, shared our operations. Defense cooperation and US support in the Pentagon in the White House, in the Congress, ensure freedom of operation and enforce our capabilities. In fact, today, we will receive the second aircraft carrying essential munition to the IDF. U.S. deployment of assets on land, in air, and at sea sends a strong message to both our partners and enemies in the region. On behalf of Israel's defense establishment and on behalf of our citizens, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. Let me remind you all, our audience, who is the enemy? Our neighbors is Hamas, the ISIS of Gaza, an organization enjoying the Iranian payroll. I cannot let the world forget the brutal attacks Hamas terrorists conduct against Israeli children, Israeli women, Israeli elderly and entire families. Murder, rape, kidnapping, this is what we face in this war. This is a war on the existence of Israel as a prosperous state, as a democratic state, as the homeland of the Jewish people. This is a war on freedom and on our common values, and we are on the front line. We will keep fighting, and we will win this war. We will prevail. With your permission, Mr. Secretary, I'll say a few words in Hebrew. מאז יום שבת, מדינת ישראל נמצאת במלחמה. אנחנו נלחמים על הבית, אנחנו נלחמים על העתיד שלנו. והפגישה שסיימנו עכשיו, ידידי מזכיר ההגנה אוסטין ואני, בבור הפיקוד, סיכמנו על שורה של מהלכים וסוגיות אסטרטגיות. אני בטוח כי גם ידידינו ברחבי העולם וגם אויבינו בכל הגזרות מבינים היטב את משמעות הברית הזו ואת משמעות הביקור הזה. מדינת ישראל היא מדינה חזקה, מדינה שבה מתקיים שילוב בין צבא עוצמתי לבין מערכת אזרחית עם חוסן לאומי בלתי רגיל.
Okay, so you're watching DW News live from Berlin. We're watching a press conference given by the US Defense Secretary and the Israeli Defense Secretary, that's Lloyd Austin and Yoav Gallant. Mr. Gallant's now speaking, addressing the meeting in Hebrew. He started off about 2 or 3 minutes ago in English, thanking Mr. Austin for US defense cooperation, which he said was to ensure the freedom of the operation and to extend Israeli capabilities. So he's thanking them for their military support. He also talked, I think he talked about an aircraft carrier being put at the disposal of Israeli defense forces. He said the US deployments send a strong message, and then described he described Hamas as the ISIS of Gaza and being on the Iranian payroll. You'll recall how throughout this last just under a week, Israel has been comparing what happened last week, Saturday, to Pearl Harbor and 9/11 combined. This, he said, is a war on the existence of Israel and a war on the freedom and on our common values. We will keep fighting and we will win this war, he said. So this is what you're watching now here on DW. Yoav Gallant speaking in Hebrew. We'll dip in a little more and then we'll hear very shortly from the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. This, of course, on the same day that the US Secretary of State is also in the region on the same issue.
התוצאות יבהירו לעולם מהי נחישותנו, מהי עוצמתנו, וכיצד אנחנו מתמודדים עם מי שמנסה להרוג את ילדינו, את זקנינו ואת נשינו, ולצערי במקרה הזה גם הצליח. חברי מזכיר ההגנה אוסטין, יש לנו משימה משותפת, הדרך תהיה ארוכה, אבל בסופו של דבר אני מבטיח לך שאנחנו ננצח. במלחמה הזו אנחנו ננצח. Thank you, sir.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yoav, we've been in close touch, but it's good to see you again in person. And it's good to be back in Israel, even during such terrible days. As the U.S. Secretary of Defense, I am here in person to make something crystal clear. America's support for Israel is ironclad. And I extend my deepest condolences to the Israeli people for those killed or wounded in this terrible slaughter by Hamas. I'm also here in solidarity with all the families still living the waking nightmare of not knowing the fate of their loved ones. And we will continue to coordinate closely with Israel to help secure the release of the innocent men, women, and children in the clutches of Hamas, including American citizens. Now, Israel is a small country, a place where everybody knows everybody. And in times of trial, the intimacy of your society deepens the intimacy of your grief. But that's not a weakness. It is a profound strength. And in times of testing, Israelis know what to do. Over this awful week, we've seen Israeli hotels and homes take in those who've had to flee. We've seen long lineups to donate blood. We've seen WhatsApps explode with messages as people race to support neighbors in anguish. And perhaps because I'm a retired general, I was especially moved by the story of a retired general named Noam T-Bone. His son called him on Saturday from his home near Gaza to say that Hamas terrorists had stormed their kibbutz and were closing in. And the retired general jumped into his car in Tel Aviv and raced toward the combat zone. He linked up with other fighters and rescued his son, his daughter-in-law, and his granddaughters. And when the general arrived at their house, one of his granddaughters just said, "Grandpa's here." And these are rays of hope in a terrible week. And in times like these, sometimes the best thing that a friend can do is just to show up and to get to work. Now, this is no time for neutrality or for false equivalence or for excuses for the inexcusable. There is never any justification for terrorism. And that's especially true after this rampage by Hamas. And anyone who wants lasting peace and security for this region must condemn and isolate Hamas. Hamas does not speak for the Palestinian people or their legitimate hopes for dignity, security, and statehood and peace alongside Israel. As a former commander of Central Command, the deliberate cruelty of Hamas vividly reminds me of ISIS. Bloodthirsty, fanatical, and hateful. And like ISIS, Hamas has nothing to offer but zealotry, bigotry, and death. The world has just witnessed a great evil. the deadliest attack on civilians in the history of the State of Israel, and the bloodiest day in Jewish history since the end of the Holocaust. So make no mistake, the United States will make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself. And Israel has a right to protect its people. You know, and there are many phone calls this week. President Biden has told Prime Minister Netanyahu that the United States would also respond swiftly and decisively to such a massive terrorist assault. And the president also underscored that democracies like ours are stronger and more secure when we uphold the laws of war. Terrorists like Hamas deliberately target civilians, but democracies don't. This is a time for resolve and not revenge, for purpose and not panic, and for security and not surrender. At President Biden's direction, we have moved urgently to respond to this crisis and to send a strong message of deterrence. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group is now in the region, led by the largest aircraft carrier in the world. We've augmented U.S. fighter aircraft squadrons in the Middle East, and the U.S. Department of Defense stands fully ready to deploy additional assets if necessary. As President Biden has said, for any country, for any group, or anyone thinking about trying to take advantage of this atrocity, to try to widen the conflict or to spill more blood, we have just one word: don't. The world is watching, and so are we. And we aren't going anywhere. We will remain in close contact with our valued partners across the region, and security assistance from the Department of Defense is already rapidly flowing into Israel. That includes munitions and air defense capabilities and other equipment and resources. It also includes more interceptors for Iron Dome to save Israeli lives. And we will continue to ensure that Israel has what it needs to keep itself secure. Now, Hamas attacked at a time of global challenge. But the United States is the most powerful country in the world, and we remain fully able to project power and uphold our commitments and direct resources to multiple theaters. So we will stand with Israel even as we stand with Ukraine. The United States can walk and chew gum at the same time. And U.S. security assistance to Israel will flow in at the speed of war. And as this harrowing week draws to a close, and as Shabbat draws near, we stand together, and we stand strong. The United States has Israel's back, and that is not negotiable, and it never will be. And after this terrible week, I wish you and all the people of Israel Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.
We'll be starting with the questions, starting with Alon Ben David, Channel 13.
Thank you,
Okay, so you're watching DW. You're watching a live press conference between the defense secretaries of the United States and Israel, obviously in reaction to the events of almost a week ago. Yoav Gallant, the Israeli Defense Secretary, spoke first and talked about defense cooperation between their two countries to, as he put it, ensure the freedom of operation of Israeli defense forces and to extend their capabilities. He and the US Secretary of State both talked about the deployment of a US battle group to the Mediterranean. And Colonel Austin made the point, or repeated the point that came from President Biden, the warning to anyone thinking of extending the conflict. He said, we have just one word, don't. So what we're going to do now is go back to that press conference and listen to the question and answer session.
אנחנו נמוטט את שלטון החמאס, אנחנו נחסל את היכולת הצבאית של חמאס, אנחנו נוודא שהאיום הזה לא קיים בגבולות שלנו, זה יהיה ממושך, זה יהיה קטלני, זה יהיה עוצמתי, וזה יהיה לתמיד.
The Israeli Defense Secretary there answering a question in Hebrew. One of the biggest points of this conflict that people have been talking about is where how the US will respond to this new conflict as it is also dealing or leading the efforts to help Ukraine against Russia. And the US Secretary of State was very firm about that. The Hamas attack came at a time of global challenge, he said. We will stand with Israel even as we stand with Ukraine.
And as we watch the civilian death toll in Gaza rise while Israel conducts its counterattacks and perhaps a ground invasion, do you believe the moral culpability for those Palestinian deaths belongs to Israel, Hamas, or both?
I'll leave it to Israel to talk about its potential plans and its approach to conducting operations. Matt, I'll just say again that Israel has a right to defend itself, and we will support Israel's right to defend itself. We will continue to flow in security assistance. And I've worked with Israeli forces over the years, over many years. As you know, I wore a uniform for 41 years. My experience in working with the Israeli forces is they are professional, they're disciplined, and they're focused on the right things. And so I expect that going forward, they will continue to exhibit that same degree of professionalism that we've seen in the past. But you know, Matt, we've seen this before. The international community fought ISIS, who in some cases was embedded deeply in built-up areas. And that international coalition fought valiantly and protected civilians and created corridors for humanitarian movement, even in the midst of a pretty significant fight. So again, this is a professional force. It is well led, and I have every expectation that it will be disciplined.
Thank you. And for Minister Gallant.
Let's get more from our senior international correspondent, Fanny Fashar in Jerusalem. Welcome, Fanny. Let's start with that meeting between the defence ministers of the two countries. Talk us through what they said.
Well, basically, the US official, US Secretary of Defense, there made it very crystal clear, just like his colleague, US Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, yesterday, who met Prime Minister Netanyahu here in Israel, that the support of the US is very much basically comparable to a blank check. Whatever Israel needs, how long it needs it, U.S. is going to be there. And as he says, that support is ironclad. So when it comes to the U.S., basically the message, make no doubt about any of that, that the United States is going to stand side by side with Israel. Now, what I find quite interesting in that statement within this press conference that I was just listening to as well, is that the defense minister there also made clear, without actually precisely naming Iran, for example, or Iran-backed Hezbollah, the militant group in Lebanon, for example, he made very much clear whoever wants to benefit from this and interfere shouldn't. He used the word don't. Pretty much the same remarks were made already by US President Biden prior to that. So once again, another US official here in Israel making clear that the US has Israel's back. Meanwhile, as these statements are being made, of course, people, especially Palestinians, ask themselves, what about the humanitarian consequences? What will that support of the United States for Israel, Israel trying to defend itself, as it says, and trying to take Hamas out, the militant group, from Gaza. What does that really will mean? What will that mean for people in a Gaza Strip? And how will you be able to make sure that the humanitarian consequences here are not going to explode into really an apocalyptic situation in Gaza Strip?
And the other big issue of the day is this IDF order to people in northern Gaza to leave to the south. And what sort of response are you seeing there from Jerusalem?
Basically, what people are trying to understand here, first of all, that order by IDF, by Israeli military, to say basically half of the population there in Gaza Strip, that's 1 million, about 1 million, should move from the north to the south. How is this practicable at all? How is that? How should that be put in action while obviously the constant bombings, while the constant airstrikes? Already we're hearing from Palestinian officials that apparently 1,500 people have been killed in Gaza Strip, among them 500 children at least. So for one, Israel warning basically the Palestinians by saying move from the north to the south, but within 24 hours, which is, as the UN says, impossible to do without any humanitarian consequences, is a way for Israel to warn. But on the other hand, how can you really help the people, the ordinary citizens who are caught up in this and who are literally trapped in this situation in Gaza Strip, as the next step is likely to unfold quite soon, which is the full-scale invasion of Israeli forces in Gaza Strip?
Thank you for that, Fanny Fashar in Jerusalem.